Hello everybody, you're welcome back again to the Reggae Appreciation Society. Us music fans always appreciate the final products from the creative minds of the producers, but we often don't see how the strategies align with the hottest cultural trends going on around us. For context, the early Jamaican singers in the 60s like Alton Ellis and Pat Kelly were chosen and recorded based on their ability to mimic American R&B legends like Lou Rawls and Sam Cooke respectively. The same way rocksteady harmony groups like the Paragons and the Techniques were modeled in the image of Motown groups like the Temptations and the Four Tops. In simple terms, producers will always replicate what is popular in society. It was this strategy and phenomenon that was directly responsible for the sound, the branding, and early identity of legendary Trenchtown musical heroes in the Wailing Souls. This super talented ensemble were originally packaged by one of the most powerful figures in Jamaica's music business to be the replacements for the most famous trio on the island in the persons of the Wailing Wailers, or just the Wailers as they became more popularly known. It was a carefully orchestrated operation that worked wonders in the beginning and almost succeeded in stealing the Wailers' thunder, but over time it ended in an entirely unforeseen scenario. Let's take a look at how the Wailing Souls were a group first conceived as a clone of the Wailers. To begin with, in 1966, the trio of Bob Marley, Bonnie Wailer and Peter Tosh were among the most popular music acts in Jamaica. It had been 3 years since that group had burst on the scene with their smash hits like Simmer Down, Lonesome Feeling and It Hurts to Be Alone, which all went to number 1 on the island's charts. They also became in-house personnel at the recording label Coxsone Records and the recording outfit in Studio One, mentoring new artists and doing session work. But despite all their heroics and efforts, the guys were still broke and were earning as little as $5 a week. After a few months of friction, the bottom dropped out when Bonnie Wailer confronted their boss, Coxsone Dodd, in an almost violent face-off that ended with the three guys leaving and breaking away to start a new chapter as independent artists. Even though Studio One was a huge and powerful outfit, the exit of the Wailers was a massive blow which left a huge gap in Coxsone Dodd's arsenal. It got even more dire as that was the peak of the competition between Dodd and his arch-rival Arthur Duke Reid of Treasure Isle Records. Studio One had been on top in the ska era, but that very year, 1966, saw the rise of rocksteady, and Treasure Isle became like ground zero of this new infectious sound, unleashing supergroups like the Techniques, the Gay Lads, and the Paragons. Coxsone Dodd by then had no powerful new groups to respond with, and was now hard-pressed to find something fresh, and preferably an act from the same musical tree of Trenchtown. Around the time the Wailers quit Studio One, 3 teenagers called Winston Matthews, aka Pipe, Lloyd MacDonald, aka Bread, and George Hay, aka Buddy, had just formed a group called the Renegades in their neighborhood in Trenchtown. They were much younger than the Wailers and saw the older trio as mentors, and like the Wailers and many others in their community, they had been students of the great Joe Higgs, a popular recording artist who dedicated himself to training youngsters in Trenchtown the rudiments of music. It was Joe Higgs who would nurture a whole generation of artists that helped to spark reggae's ascendance onto the world stage. The Renegades, led by Winston Matthews, had matured around the Wailers and had formed their sound, which had an uncanny resemblance to their older colleagues. Over time, the word about their incredible vocal abilities spread throughout Trenchtown and eventually the studio session circuits all over Kingston, and they were soon in high demand to work as backup vocalists. After more than a year, growing in confidence and sharpening their skills, the Renegades would set out one fine Sunday morning to Studio One for an audition. Sundays were traditionally the day for Studio One auditions, with hordes of wannabe singers besieging that outfit for a chance to impress the Dawn. Coxsone Dodd was notorious for being very hard to please and often cut most singers off after a few seconds. When the Renegades came in, they didn't look confident, but when they opened their mouths, something huge would happen. They sang a song called Gold Diggers, which Joe Higgs had made them rehearse non-stop, and when they belted it out, Coxsone Dodd was blown away with their sparkling performance and the significance of what he had just witnessed. They weren't just great singers with wonderful harmonies, but they sounded just like the Wailers, especially lead singer Pipe Matthews, whose voice was identical to Bob Marley's. And he took them on immediately and began to groom them into a replacement for his former artists, the Wailers. He would hone their crafts as backup vocalists for other artists in the studio for a while, before he would produce and unleash their breakout singles like Row Fisherman Row, Mr. Fire Coleman, and Back Out With, under different stage names like Pipe and the Pipers and the Classics, as Dodd felt the name Renegades made them sound like rude boys. In line with the final stage of his plan, he got the brainwave to capitalize on the Wailers brand by renaming them the Wailing Souls, strikingly similar and a play on the Wailing Wailers. They would record a slew of classics for Studio One that became very popular in Jamaica over the next 3 years. But the most intriguing part of all this is that most people who listened and danced to their music or bought their records thought they were listening to the Wailers. The real Wailers were at that time really struggling to find their feet as independent artists and weren't very visible, so it became very easy for the public to mistake the Wailing Souls for the Wailers, especially with their vocal similarities. But rather than the arrangements develop into a long-term partnership, the Wailing Souls would, like many artists before them who had worked for Coxsone Dodd, left Studio One and parted ways with him in 1970. They would go on to work with producer Lloyd Daly and were then desperate to stop the confusion and being mistaken for the Wailers. And this led them to record singles under various new names like Atara and even old names like Pipe and the Pipers and the Classics. They had undergone a few lineup changes and were dead serious about developing an identity of their own instead of continuing as clones of the Wailers. And strange enough, in what I call delicious irony, the Wailing Souls would work and record for Top Gun Records a few years later under the name of Pipe and the Pipers, releasing brilliant songs like Back Out and Harbour Shark in 1974. It's been speculated that Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer in particular weren't too fond of the Wailing Souls name and forced them to use Pipe and the Pipers to release their records under their label. They spent the first few years after Studio One doing their best to distance themselves from their days as Wailers copycats. What I found most interesting is how even after several lineup changes that saw them settle as a 4-man group that included Black Uhuru founding member Gar Dennis and developing a unique sound of their own, they would go back and embrace the name Wailing Souls big time. Some say it's because the original Wailers had broken up, while others say that they felt comfortable in their own skins, their abilities, and the Trenchtown concept of wailing about the oppression and injustice in Babylon. But whatever the case, they would end the 70s on a powerful note when they would enter into collaboration with the popular Channel 1 studios and unleashed a slew of hit songs like Things and Time, Backbiter, and my personal favorites, Jaja Give Us Life to Live, all ably powered by the studio's elite in-house backing band, The Revolutionaries, with Sly and Robbie on the rhythm section. They continued on their fine form right into the 1980s when they began to collaborate with dancehall producer Henry Jonjo Laws, that saw the release of their incredible album Firehouse Rock in 1981. And most incredibly, this group, though back down to 2 again, with Winston Matthews and Lloyd McDonald as last men standing, stayed very consistent and are till date still touring and performing at reggae festivals all over the globe. In fact, their last album, Backyard, came out in 2021. They are without a doubt among the great groups in reggae's pantheons of legends. And though they were conceived initially as replacements or clones of the Wailers, the global reggae fraternity celebrates them as champions and heroes of the Trenchtown movement and Joe Higgs school of music, and exponents of that style reminiscent and synonymous with the area that they started from. So there you have it. Thank you for watching this video today. Please leave a like, subscribe, and until next time, Jah bless.